Have you ever asked yourself why you always end up exhausted, emotionally drained, and feeling like no one ever truly sees you? Why, after all the effort, the sacrifices, the nights where you swallowed your own needs to be the bigger person, you still feel invisible? There's a reason for this, and it runs deeper than just being too nice or too available. It's because somewhere along the way, you were taught that love is something you must earn, that affection only comes when you're useful, that your worth is tied not to who you are but to what you offer, to how much of yourself you're willing to give up for someone else's comfort. Maybe it started in your childhood. Maybe you were the quiet one, the good kid who never complained, who took care of everyone else's emotions while no one ever really asked about yours. Maybe you were praised not for being whole, but for being agreeable, and that praise felt like love. So you repeated it, again and again, until you forgot what it feels like to speak your truth without fear. As an adult, this conditioning doesn't vanish. It mutates. It follows you into relationships where you apologize for your boundaries, into friendships where you give and give and give, only to be forgotten when you're no longer needed, into family dynamics where your silence is expected and your presence taken for granted. You've become the emotional support system for people who never check if you're breaking. You carry burdens that don't belong to you. You smile when you want to scream. You say, "It's fine," when everything inside you is falling apart. And still, you believe that maybe, if you just keep showing up, someone will finally stay for you, not for what you provide. But here's the harsh truth no one likes to admit. You taught people that you exist to serve. You didn't do it on purpose. You did it because you were scared to lose them. And they, knowingly or not, took advantage of that. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to survive, a role we create to gain approval in a world that doesn't reward authenticity. The persona makes you appear strong, stable, generous, and selfless, but behind it, you're exhausted. And more than that, you're forgotten. If this spoke to a version of you that's been hiding for far too long, comment below. I'm done performing. Let's create a space for those who are finally choosing authenticity over approval. This is why your relationships feel hollow, why you can be surrounded by people and still feel utterly alone. Because no one loves the real you. They don't even know who that is. They love the version of you that always says yes, that never complains, that stays silent so others can speak louder. You have been playing a part for so long that the idea of taking off the mask terrifies you. Because if you stop being useful, will they still choose you? It's a brutal question. And the answer, most of the time, is even more brutal. No, they won't. Because they weren't in love with your soul. They were attached to the role you performed in their lives. Let that sink in. It's not just that they didn't love you. It's that they never even saw you. Because you never gave them the chance. You were too busy being what they needed. And now, you've forgotten what you need. This is why you feel that void in your chest. Not because people left, but because you were never fully there to begin with. You built a life where you only existed through your function. The helper, the listener, the fixer, the peacekeeper. But what happens when you stop performing? Who's left? And maybe you're afraid that if you finally show up as yourself, everything will fall apart. That people will walk away. That you'll be seen as selfish, cold, hard. But what if I told you that's exactly what needs to happen? Because the only relationships worth keeping are the ones where your presence is enough. Not your performance, not your usefulness, just you, in your truth, in your boundaries, in your fullness. But to get there, you'll have to confront a very old pain. The pain of being chosen only when you're pleasing. The grief of realizing that the love you thought you had was only available as long as you hid yourself. That hurts, but it also frees you. Because now you knowing you're not loved less because you changed. You're loved less because you stopped being easy to use. And that is the beginning of everything. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But no one tells you that to claim that privilege, you'll first have to lose the version of you everyone else depended on. You'll have to lose the comfort of being needed. You'll have to step into discomfort. The space where your real voice lives. The space where you finally get to ask, what do I want if I'm not trying to be wanted? And that question, that terrifying, honest, sacred question, is the doorway to healing. But healing requires truth, and truth requires loss. And loss, as painful as it is, clears the space for something real to begin. So ask yourself, with all the courage you have left, who are you when you're not trying to be useful? What remains when the performance ends? And if that question burns, don't run. Let it burn. Let it burn everything that was never really yours to carry. Because on the other side of that fire is you. But this is just the first layer. Because once you begin to show your real self, the version without the mask, something strange happens. People start to pull away. And that's exactly what we'll talk about next. Because when you change, some people disappear. And that, my friend, is not a tragedy. It's the truth finally doing its work. Are you ready to face that truth? So, you stopped performing. You stopped bending, shrinking, smiling on command. You started saying no. Not in anger, not in rebellion, just in quiet honesty. And that's when the silence began. At first, it's subtle. A message left unread. A call that goes unanswered. Invitations that never arrive. People you used to drop everything for suddenly become distant, cold, absent. You tell yourself they're busy, that life is just moving fast, that maybe you did something wrong without realizing. But deep down, a deeper truth begins to whisper. You didn't change into someone worse. You just stopped being convenient. The reality is brutal, and no one prepares you for it. When you grow, when you heal, when you reclaim yourself, you lose people. Not because you became unlovable, but because you stopped being who they could use. This is one of the most painful parts of waking up. Because you thought these relationships were real. You thought the connection ran deep. But what you realize, slowly, painfully, is that it only ran as deep as your willingness to self-abandon. When you stop showing up to solve every crisis, to carry emotional weight that was never yours, to be the buffer between people and their own consequences, the spell breaks. And with it, the illusion of love. You start to see who truly cared, and who only cared when you served a purpose. It hits hardest in moments of silence. Birthdays pass without messages. Milestones go unnoticed. And you sit there, wondering if you ever really mattered to them, or if you just made their lives easier. The people you thought would always be there begin to vanish the moment you step into your truth. Why does this happen? Because your healing exposes their comfort zone. Your boundaries reflect their entitlement. And your emotional clarity makes their dysfunction impossible to hide. Some people don't want you whole. They want you broken, because your brokenness made you compliant, made you forgiving, made you available. When you start showing up for yourself, you stop being useful to people who depended on your silence, and they don't know how to handle it. So instead of adapting, they retreat. Instead of meeting your truth, they disappear. But here's the thing no one tells you. Their absence is not a punishment. It's proof. Proof that they were never truly there. Not for you, but for the role you played in their lives. It's a harsh mirror, and it reflects more than you're ready to see. Because it doesn't just show you who they were. It shows you who you were. Someone who believed that love had to be earned by disappearing into the needs of others. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves." And maybe that irritation, that ache in your chest is exactly that. A signal. A sign that the version of love you accepted was never love at all. You might be tempted to chase them, to explain, to prove that you're still worthy even without being their emotional crutch. But if you have to convince someone to stay, they were never holding your heart. They were only holding their convenience. And maybe you'll try to go back. Maybe for a moment, the silence will get too loud. You'll find yourself drafting a message, trying to soften your truth, to return to the version of yourself that everyone liked. But that version is gone now. You've outgrown it. And even if you try to squeeze back in, it won't fit anymore. Have you ever felt like people only loved the version of you that served them? Share your story in the comments. Someone else might need to read it today. That's the hidden cost of healing. You lose not only the people who took you for granted, you also lose the false sense of belonging you had with them. It's disorienting, like stepping out of a crowded room into a vast, empty forest. But here's what's waiting in that silence. Clarity. You begin to notice who checks in only when they need something, who supports you only when you're struggling, because your weakness keeps them secure, who compliments you only when you're making sacrifices for them. And worst of all, you start seeing the ways you allowed it. You weren't weak, you were scared. Scared to be alone. Scared to be labeled difficult. Scared that if you stopped playing the role, no one would love the real you. But that fear kept you trapped in a cycle of betrayal, not by others but by yourself. And now that you're stepping out of that role, the losses feel like a death, because they are. The death of your people-pleasing persona, the death of relationships built on imbalance, the death of illusions you carried for years, maybe decades. It hurts. Of course it hurts. You'll cry for the people who left. You'll grieve the version of you that kept them around. You'll sit in rooms you used to fill with laughter and wonder why they're so quiet now. But eventually, and this is where the shift begins, you'll realize something. The quiet isn't a void. It's a clearing, a space being made. Not for everyone, but for those who can love the version of you that no longer needs to be needed. And that's the kind of love worth waiting for. The kind that doesn't require performance. The kind that sees your soul, not your sacrifice. So no, you didn't lose them because you became selfish. You lost them because you stopped betraying yourself to keep them comfortable. That is not loss. That is alignment. And even though it still stings, you're exactly where you need to be. Because the pain of losing them is nothing compared to the pain of losing yourself. Again, now comes the part no one prepares you for. What happens after the mask breaks, after the people leave, and after the silence settles? You're left with yourself. And for the first time in a long time, there's no applause, no validation, no one to please. Just you, just your presence. And that presence, it's been waiting to be heard. In the next part, we'll explore what it really means to live without the mask. What happens when you can't go back to the old version of you, but you haven't fully stepped into the new one yet. The space between personas and authenticity, the in-between, the most fragile, sacred part of the journey. There comes a moment in everyone's life when the performance becomes too heavy, when smiling feels like lying, when being the strong one starts to feel like a prison sentence. That moment doesn't come all at once. It creeps in, slowly, quietly, a growing discomfort, a lingering sadness that you can't explain, a strange emptiness, even when everything on the outside seems fine. It's not depression, it's not burnout, it's the soul's rebellion. You begin to notice small things. You hesitate before answering a message you would have responded to immediately before. You withdraw from conversations that once felt effortless. You feel a growing distance from your own routines, your own voice, your own life. It's not that the world changed. It's that you're finally seeing the role you've been playing and realizing it's not you. Carl Jung called this role the persona, a mask we create to navigate society, not out of malice, but out of survival. In childhood, you learned quickly what made people love you. Maybe it was being quiet, or helpful, or perfect. Maybe you were praised when you performed, rewarded when you adapted, validated when you sacrificed. So you adjusted, bit by bit, and it worked. For a while. But here's the hidden danger. The longer you wear the mask, the more you forget your own face. You begin to confuse the persona with the self. You start believing that who you are is what others admire. The responsible one, the agreeable one, the selfless one. But what happens when those traits no longer reflect your truth? What happens when you're tired of being agreeable? When you crave freedom more than approval? When the persona starts to feel like a costume stitched together by fear? It cracks. And when it cracks, everything you've built on top of it begins to shake. Relationships, careers, routines, all built around who you were pretending to be. When the mask slips, those structures wobble. Some collapse. And in the rubble, you find a terrifying question. If I'm not that version of myself, who am I? This is the part most people avoid. Because discovering who you are without the mask means letting go of who you thought you had to be to feel safe. It means shedding layers, not of clothing, but of identity. You'll find that many of your choices weren't truly yours, that the dreams you chased were inherited, that the relationships you held onto were sustained by performance. One woman described it like this: I was always the friend everyone called for advice. I thought it meant they trusted me, but I realized they just liked that I never asked for anything back. She wasn't loved, she was needed, and when she stopped giving so much, she stopped getting calls. This is what happens when the persona dies. You begin to lose everything that was never aligned with your truth. And at first it feels like your life is falling apart. But what's really happening is that everything false is falling away. The grief is real. You grieve the relationships that don't survive your honesty. You grieve the identity you spent years building, even if it never made you happy. You grieve the version of you that knew how to keep everyone else comfortable, even if it meant abandoning yourself. And yet, underneath all the grief, something else begins to stir. A quiet curiosity, a whisper of your own voice, the sense that maybe, just maybe, there's more to you than what you've shown. But it's unfamiliar. You've spent so long perfecting the mask that facing your real self feels like staring into the eyes of a stranger. This is the paradox. The mask was meant to protect you, and at some point, it did. But it also trapped you. And breaking free means entering a world with no script. There's no guide for how to be authentic when you've spent your whole life being agreeable. There's no checklist for how to speak your truth when silence has always kept you safe. So you stumble, you speak up, and your voice shakes. You set boundaries, and feel guilty. You choose yourself, and wonder if you're being selfish. But with each step, clarity comes. You start to realize that authenticity isn't about being fearless. It's about being willing. Willing to be misunderstood. Willing to disappoint. Willing to lose people who only loved your mask. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege doesn't come free. It costs the version of you that was never real. And this transformation, as liberating as it is, can feel incredibly lonely. Because as you stop performing, as you stop fitting into old molds, you find yourself in between identities. No longer the person you used to be, not yet fully the person you're becoming. It's disorienting. You walk into rooms and realize you don't laugh at the same jokes. You sit in silence and feel the absence of old habits. You look in the mirror and wonder where you went. But this in-between space, this fragile, quiet void, is sacred. It's where your true self begins to speak. Not with certainty, but with honesty. Not with perfection, but with presence. And that voice, however faint, however unsure, carries a truth that no applause, no approval, no mask could ever offer. Because for the first time, it's yours. So let the old self mourn. Let the mask fall. Let the silence speak. You are not lost. You are emerging. And in the next part, we'll explore what that emergence looks like, the freedom and fear of becoming someone others no longer recognize, and how your authenticity can both repel and reveal the people around you. Are you ready to keep going? Then let's step deeper. If you're in that sacred space between who you were and who you're becoming, type, "I'm not lost, I'm becoming." Let's stand together in the in-between. At some point in this journey, after the mask has cracked and the performance has ended, you begin to notice something unexpected. The people who once needed you so desperately now seem almost uncomfortable in your presence. Not because you've wronged them, not because you've changed into someone cruel or distant, but because you're no longer the version of yourself that made them feel powerful, needed, or important. You're no longer the savior. You're no longer the solution. You're no longer the emotional sponge who absorbed everyone's chaos just to keep the peace. And so one by one, they start to drift. Some do it quietly, a slow fade. Others leave loudly, accusing you of becoming selfish, cold, or not who you used to be. But what they're really saying is this: you're no longer easy to use. And as painful as it is to hear those doors close behind you, there's a strange sense of clarity that begins to rise. For the first time, you're no longer trying to hold together relationships that only worked when you were abandoning yourself. What you're experiencing is not rejection, it's alignment. Because the moment you start showing up in your truth, the people who were only attached to your performance can no longer recognize you or reach you. And their discomfort? It's not about who you've become. It's about who they can no longer manipulate. Carl Jung said, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And this is the paradox of awakening. The more authentic you become, the lonelier it feels, at first. Because real connection only happens when your soul is seen. And that's rare. It's not found in the crowd. It's found in silence, in stillness, in the sacred space left behind when the unworthy exit your life. You may find yourself sitting in familiar places that now feel foreign. You'll hear your name said in ways that no longer sound right. You'll realize how much of your old life was built on a version of you that was never meant to last. And you'll ache, Not for those who left, but for the years you lost trying to keep them. But there's a truth most people overlook. Being abandoned for being yourself is not a curse. It's a cleansing. It's like the shedding of old skin. Painful, vulnerable, raw, but necessary. Because what's leaving you now was never yours to begin with. It was borrowed love, conditional acceptance, fragile connections built on imbalance. And while the grief is real, so is the freedom. There's peace in not having to explain yourself anymore. There's power in saying no without apology. There's beauty in finally being misunderstood, not because you're unclear, but because you've stopped making yourself small enough to be easily understood. This shift, this sacred removal of everything false, creates space. And that space, quiet, aching, uncomfortable, is where truth begins to live. But the world doesn't reward that truth immediately. You won't be celebrated for choosing yourself. You'll be criticized, questioned, maybe even pitied. People will say you've changed, and you have. But what they don't understand is that you didn't become someone else. You stopped being someone you never truly were. It's a quiet revolution. One no one sees, but you feel in every breath. The kind of revolution where you choose silence over explanation, where you walk away without looking back, where you begin to honor the version of you that stayed hidden for far too long. And yes, it will cost you. You'll lose relationships. You'll lose the image people had of you. You might even lose parts of your identity that were built around being needed. But what you gain in return is priceless. You gain yourself. And as you settle into this new place, where your presence no longer revolves around other people's comfort, something else begins to unfold. You start to feel peace. Not the fake peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the real peace that comes from no longer being at war with yourself. That peace is your foundation now. And from that place, something even more powerful begins to emerge. The ability to rebuild your life, not from who you were expected to be, but from who you truly are. But how do you build a new life when the old one has fallen away? How do you rise from the ashes of roles and relationships that no longer fit? That's what we'll explore next. The sacred rebirth that comes after the breakdown, and how finding yourself in the silence becomes the beginning of everything real. Let's step into what comes after the loss. There is a stillness that follows the storm, a strange quiet that settles in once the old roles have crumbled, the masks have fallen, and the people who only loved your performance have faded into the background. At first, this stillness feels unbearable, like standing in the ruins of a life you no longer recognize. But slowly, subtly, it becomes something else, spacious. You begin to notice that without the noise of other people's expectations, you can finally hear your own voice. It's soft at first, unsure, but it's there. And unlike the voices you used to follow, this one doesn't demand perfection. It simply asks for honesty. You don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to explain your boundaries, justify your silence, or negotiate your worth. You just have to show up, as you are. This is the rebirth Carl Jung spoke of. Not a flashy transformation, but a quiet return. A return to yourself, to the parts of you that were buried under compliance, to the dreams you postponed for approval, to the emotions you swallowed for the sake of harmony. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you to forget. And it's here, in this stripped, sacred place, that you begin to build again. But this time, you're not building a persona. You're building a life, one choice at a time, one moment of honesty at a time, one brave no, followed by a deeply rooted yes to yourself. You'll find that some days still hurt. There will be echoes of the past, temptations to return to what's familiar, but you won't, because you've tasted freedom. And once you've known that kind of peace, the peace of being whole, not useful, you can't go back to fragments. The world might not understand your transformation, but that's okay. You didn't change for them. You changed for your soul, and your soul knows the way. Carl Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." You are awake now, and this is just the beginning. Thank you for walking through this with me. If this message touched something deep inside you, if it named a pain you've carried in silence, know that you're not alone. This journey is hard, but it's also holy. You are not broken. You are breaking free. If you're ready to keep going, to dive deeper into the healing, The next video is waiting for you. And if this resonated with your heart, let me know in the comments. I choose wholeness. Let's see how many of us are ready to live without masks. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing yourself. And above all, thank you for surviving long enough to finally come home.